All right, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. My name is Keith Spencer, and I'm one of our career experts here at FlexJobs. FlexJobs, for those of you who may not know, has been one of the most trusted and leading sites for remote job listings since 2007. We are thrilled to have as our guest today, Carol Cochran, VP of People and Culture at FlexJobs, to discuss how to build and sustain a healthy company culture in the remote and hybrid workplace. Before we turn things over to Carol, I'd like to cover a couple housekeeping items. This webinar will be roughly 45 minutes in length with Carol's presentation followed by an audience Q&A. The webinar is being recorded and the recording will be emailed out to you later this week. If you'd like to ask Carol a question, please feel free to type it in the Q&A section, not the chat section. The Q&A section allows us to keep track of questions in one place, and you're also able to click a thumbs up if someone else has asked a question that you would like to hear the answer to. We won't be able to answer everyone's question today, but we can almost guarantee you will learn something helpful. All right, let's go ahead and turn things over to Carol. Welcome, Carol.
Hello, Keith, and good morning. Thank you so much for making some time for me today. And thank you, everybody, for being here to have the conversation. I'm excited to dive right in. All right. So today, what we're going to talk about mainly is how do we take a culture and from a traditional office setting and then translate that into what does it look like when we're hybrid or we're remote? We're going to talk about some specific tools for engaging employees in that hybrid or remote environment. And then we're going to talk about how do you actively foster and sustain a culture long term? How do you keep it fresh? How do you keep it strong? And how do you keep it as one of the superpowers of your company? So how culture happens. I'm so sorry, but quick technical thing. I'm not seeing the slides advance, so I'm not sure if I'm actually supposed to do that or not. Sorry, Katie, in the background. But anyways, we'll just keep going. So how culture happens, it just does, right? Culture in a company happens whether we pay attention to it or not. And I'm sure there are a number of us that have been in environments. Hopefully you've been in an environment where there was a real strong company culture, but you may have been in environments where it just didn't feel very clear. And there was almost different cultures depending on what part of the company you were in or interacting with and things like that. So it happens, and it's really, it behooves companies to manage those cultures in a proactive, strategic, and intentional way. So before we dive into the hows and the what, we really want to take a step back and define what does company culture mean, and particularly in the context of our conversation today. So culture is essentially a set of beliefs and values that inform how work gets done in your company or on your team. It defines what those core values are that are important and that everything needs to tie back to. It drives a lot of how decisions are made based on those core values in the culture. It should explain the why. Why are we doing what we're doing? How does each person's role within the company impact and contribute to the company's overall success? And how do you effectively set expectations and create an environment that fosters a lot of creativity and innovation along with a highly productive workforce? Every company is unique, right? Whether it's what are we doing in our company, what service or goods do we provide, the leadership of the company, how companies are structured, where people work from. in addition to each company being unique, company culture is also very unique. So again, this is how we define it and why it's so important to be strategic and pay attention to it. What is culture not? You really don't want to try and take a one size fits all strategy. So what does that mean? You don't want your culture from a top level to be so defined that it doesn't leave room for teams to be able to perform, interact, engage, collaborate the way they need to for the best outcomes. What you want to do is you want to provide some guardrails. You want to provide the foundation for what is important to us and what is the expectation in terms of how, again, we get work done together. And then where's the space for other leaders within the organization and teams and individuals to play within that space. It's not things like the company dress code. I've been working remotely for well over 20 years, and I am a big fan of my hoodies and my leggings. And as delightful as that is not culture either. It's not things like perks and benefits. Those are a reflection of the company culture. And I'll give you an example of an in-person perk that we often reflect as a culture piece, right? So I'll hear people say like, oh, it was such a great company culture when I worked in this office. They had coffee bar and they did lunches on Wednesdays and happy hours on Fridays. And there was a gym on site. And those are great. That's a reflection of the culture. And I'm sure there's a really good intention to make things pleasant and convenient for the workforce, right? I would also argue that is a way to get people to stay at work longer, right? Offer them breakfast and a gym and happy hours, and they'll be in the office longer. So why does culture matter, and why does paying special attention to it when it's a remote or hybrid environment? What are sort of the special things we need to pay attention to? So let's start with some of the false assumptions that we probably often hear and maybe at times have even believed ourselves about remote and hybrid culture. We talk about how it's real hard to that you can't develop connection between individuals within a hybrid or remote culture, that you can't collaborate on the same level. I submit to you that is not only false, but there are a lot of examples, including FlexJobs, of very strong, healthy cultures that have been remote and or hybrid, even pre-pandemic, that do this really well. A lot of it starts with asking yourself, what will a touch point look like if we were in office together? Do we like what that touch point would look like? And if so, how can we best recreate the outcome we would be looking for in office in a remote environment, right? So I always encourage people to start there. And it doesn't matter if you're an HR leader or you have a team of 2 people. You still want to think about it from that perspective. Again, your culture is going to communicate those values and expectations from a sort of company-wide organizational level. But also the point of it should be to allow people the space to do their best work in that role, in that company, and in that environment. The other great benefit to having a strong company culture that you're intentional and strategic about is that it really does help you hire and retain the best talent for your company, not only from a geographical region, but we know that that a lot of people leave as a result of a toxic culture. And we're going to get into that in just a second. So starting with how do you take in office and translate that? So, you know, I think a lot of companies at the start of the pandemic, there were so many organizations and workers who were very quickly forced into a remote space, right? And I think that in most cases, everybody did the best they could to make it work as well as possible. And in some cases, it worked really, really well. And both individuals and organizations saw the benefits of that. And they're sustaining some level of remote and or hybrid, right? Um, there were a lot of people, particularly from the organization side, that said, gosh, this just feels different. It's a lot harder. Like I'm feeling, it was a little destabilizing as well. And so I think the really progressive companies and organizations now are taking a look back, and instead of just doing a blanket return to work, or even a really prescriptive hybrid culture, they're looking at the foundation of what they've built over the last few years and saying, how can we improve and optimize this to make it work better? FlexJobs recently did a survey a few months back. And in that survey, we found that 62% of people said that they quit because of a toxic company culture. One that didn't feel healthy, one that they didn't feel like they could bring their best and whole self to the job. And also interesting is the statistic that 55% of employee engagement is not driven by compensation, is not driven by benefits. It's driven by recognition that people are meeting expectations, that people are having an impact. Again, explaining that why. How did your work on that specific project benefit our company, our customers, our internal team, whatever it may be? So those types of recognition actually drive about 55% of positive employee engagement. So how do you improve upon what you have? You need to be able to clearly define it. I always encourage companies, if they haven't done this exercise, to start with defining what are the company values. And there's different ways to do this. Sometimes that's done in a top-down manner where leadership comes together and they have conversations and they define what those values are. Sometimes that's done as more of a bottom up, where it starts with employees and then kind of filters up, and then decisions are made from there. There's not necessarily a wrong way to do it. I would say it depends on the organization. It also depends on kind of where you're starting at, right? What's the current health of your company culture? And how do you normally approach communication and collaboration on an organizational level? So you want to consider those things when you're deciding how to do this. From an experience point of view, you definitely want to start this in the onboarding process. You could even make an argument, a very strong argument, that this starts the minute you write a job posting and publish that, right? You are communicating what your culture is, what the expectations are, even within the recruiting process. It has to be actively managed. You can't get to a place where you feel like, okay, I feel like this is a really good, healthy culture. Everybody's thriving. Everyone's engaged. I'm going to go work on something else now. It's not an every day, every minute attention, but it is something that you want to check in on frequently, and you want to be actively managing it. You will have times where maybe a particular program or initiative that was had a lot of engagement and or really made people very happy, feel very satisfied. And maybe it's just kind of losing some steam. That's okay, right? You can step away from that. You can pivot. You can introduce a new program or initiative at that point. But that comes from active management. And you want to make your culture, you want to be able to define that and communicate that in a very transparent way, and you want to make it a priority. So what does that mean to make it a priority? First of all, you want to start with, again, with your hiring. You want to hire people who fit culturally. And I want to pause for a second here. There is a lot, there's a lot of discussion about hiring for cultural fit, et cetera. So please keep in mind what I just talked about in terms of core values, right? When I say fit culturally, I mean, are they aligned with the core values? Are they aligned with the culture? how your organization collaborates, how they communicate, how they provide feedback to one another. What do those relationships look like and what are those expectations? And will this person thrive in that environment? So that's what we mean when we say that. You want to invest in people's personal lives. And this can be a little bit of a provocative statement, right? Work is supposed to be work and home is supposed to be home. However, when we're in remote and hybrid environments, that's no longer the case. We're working in our homes in a lot of cases. So I am not suggesting that you get all up in everybody's business and try to be a control freak about it. What I am suggesting is it's part of that transparent communication and actively managing the culture. You provide a space that is safe and respectful where people can come forward and either share just general things, whether it's about their families or their personal interests or upcoming travel or things like that, right? Get to know your people. Part of what that does for you is it helps you understand what are their extrinsic and intrinsic motivators. From a leadership perspective and from getting the most out of people, that is such an important place to start, right? What motivates people? Well, you do that by getting to know them. And that's what we mean when we say invest in their personal lives. Also, if you want a whole person culture, meaning people bring their best selves to the job, right? Which more and more companies are adopting this. FlexJobs has been doing this for years with great results. You want to have a space where somebody can say, whether they're giving you details or not, somebody can say, hey, listen, I have something big going on in life. And I either am going to need to flex my schedule a little bit more. I might need some additional support, and this is what that will look like. Again, they don't have to give details. None of us do. We can if that's what we're comfortable with, or with certain people giving details. But there needs to be that safe space and that trust on everybody's part that people can step up and say, I need a little space to pay more attention to some things in my personal life right now. And we need to do what we can as organizations to support that. And trust me, I promise you the dividends will pay tenfold going forward. We've talked a lot about communication and collaboration. You really want to think about that. It is so critical, particularly in a remote and hybrid environment. If you have people working in office, let's focus on hybrid for a second. If you have people working in office and you have people working remotely, what does that look like? Are remote people always remote? Are in office always in office? Is it a switch? What are the expectations when people who are working remotely are collaborating and communicating with people who are working in the office? What does that look like? How do you do that effectively? I don't know if you've ever been the remote person sitting on your laptop in your home office and you dial in and there's like 8 people in a conference room and you're on the big screen. It's workable. It's definitely not the best approach. I'll say that. There you end up creating a clear division, whether it's intentional or not, between your remote and your in-office staff in that instance. So you want to look for ways to make sure that communication and collaboration is pretty seamless and provides the same opportunities in an equitable, inclusive manner so that everybody feels like they belong, right? And then most importantly, particularly with remote, you have to lead with trust, right? If your hiring process is dialed in and you know that to the best of any talent acquisition professional's ability, you are hiring the right talent. You have to start from a place of trust to allow them that autonomy and that freedom to create the environment that they need to be the most successful, to create the schedule that they feel makes them most successful. And that comes from giving people trust and not trying to dictate with too heavy of a hand what things need to look like. Let people know what the expectations are. What are the deliverables? What outcomes are you looking for? What are the deadlines? And give them the space to do their jobs.
Well, If I might dive in a moment, we have two questions
Yes.
in the Q&A that I think are highly relevant to this slide. The first question is sort of asking, is company culture sort of interchangeable with the word values? And, using values instead, does that maybe make it more tangible for employees? And then another related question, when talking about hiring people who fit culturally, how do you ensure that you are not inadvertently sort of discriminating in your understanding of fit?
Great questions. Thank you so much to whoever asked those. Um, so, starting with the first one, um, the between culture and values, you can, and there are definitely organizations who do that. You'll see it on company pages or the About Us or career page. They'll highlight those values. So it's really whatever feels best for your organization. And I would also offer where you are in the process, right? The values are the core of it. That is the foundation, right? So I'll try and give a real life example real quick. At FlexJobs, some of our values are integrity, intelligence, balance, care, and communication, right? Everything kind of stems from that. And there's a little bit of context around each of those things. So those values are definitely the basics of it. But over the years, as we continued developing our culture and what that looks like and how to communicate that culture, values are great, but at some point you have to tell them what that means, right? So, how does a sense, what do you mean by communication? Like that feels like a very basic skill in the workforce, right? So, how is communication a value? Well, for FlexJobs, that value is that we are transparent, we are proactive, we are respectful, right? And we are very open with our communication. We really strive to create safe spaces where feedback flows from one person to another, regardless of position within the company. So yes, if starting with values and really focusing on that or using that language feels more comfortable for your organization, you can absolutely use that language. I would just also encourage you, don't stop there with the actual work of strategizing and managing your culture. And then in terms of hiring people to fit culturally and not inadvertently discriminating, yes, thank you. That's kind of where I was trying to go. And obviously, I didn't do a real good job with that. So, again, tie it back to the values, right? The value of integrity for FlexJob doesn't really, I don't see that as a discriminatory point, right? I am perfectly comfortable um, making the assessment that if someone has a clear lack of integrity through the hiring process, and this is obviously like kind of a silly example because you would hope that most job seekers are smart enough to not do that within the hiring process. But let's say it happens, right? I'm very comfortable saying, no, we don't want people who don't take integrity seriously for themselves and the people around them. We don't want them to be working here. It's not going to be the right fit, right? I don't see that as being discriminatory. Now, you also, in line with your other DEIB initiatives within your organization, you have to make sure, of course, that you're not discriminating in your hiring practices based on those big things, right? Whether that's sexual orientation, gender, marital status, race, any of those things. And there should be other things built into your recruiting process that minimize any bias, whether it's unconscious or otherwise, that may exist. But hiring for cultural fit is never intended to be discriminating. It is intended to make sure we're all starting from the same core place, right? If I value intelligence because that leads to greater collaboration, greater innovation, greater being progressive in the way we approach business and our products, then again, that's not a discriminatory point, right? Because that is not tied to any of those other characteristics that we want to make sure we have great diversity with. All right. Any other questions, or should we keep going, Keith?
I think we are good to keep going. Thank you, Carol.
Absolutely. So what are the business benefits, right? Like in a perfect, like kind of la world, right? We could just make the argument that investing in culture and having a strong company culture that drives engagement and in productivity is just the right thing to do, right? It's about treating people well, and it's the right thing to do. But we a lot of us are working for organizations who are in the business of profits as well, right? Very fair. So what are the business benefits to investing in culture? It definitely drives engagement. We've talked about that, and particularly that non-financial recognition, right? How people feel about the work they're doing, the people they're doing it with, and the organization they're doing it for definitely makes a difference in how engaged, in how they show up for you. It builds a lot of loyalty, which can definitely help retain and, I would argue, attract top talent, depending on your hiring strategies, right? So we will often do a piece in our hiring process where a candidate is able to meet with people who would be colleagues of theirs, just to ask some questions, let those colleagues ask questions, that sort of thing. So how people feel about the company, how strong that culture is, definitely comes through, not only in those conversations, but even with your recruiting team, right? Your hiring managers. People know if you genuinely feel a good experience and a loyalty and a pride in working with your company, even through the hiring process. It definitely bolsters productivity, and ultimately, that's what we're looking to do, right? Create and maintain that space for people to do their best work at your organization. So if people are not spending time trying to get clarity around communications, if people are not spending time trying to understand what a process looks like to get something done, if people are not spending time trying to find the right person to help them get something done, right? Those all lead to better productivity. And a lot of that is tied to your culture. So overall, hopefully this kind of indicates to you the overall company success is really supported in some really meaningful and some deep ways with a strong culture. Okay, so let's talk about some tools and best practices. Let's get a little bit tactical here. So first of all, you want to create a formal policy. You want to share it. You want to be transparent about it. Again, don't be too heavy-handed with what it looks like. Don't do a one-size-fits-all. So I know some organizations will say where hybrid finance and legal comes in on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Design and product comes in on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, whatever that might look like, right? But those things at that level should really be decided not at a top level way. You want to provide that framework, those core values, and the expectations, and then let people figure out within their working groups or teams how they can achieve that, how they can align to that in a way that helps their team work the most efficiently and productively. Solid communication. I cannot stress how important strong and effective communication is. What you don't want to have is a situation where people open up a piece of communication, an email, a newsletter, whatever it is, and it creates more questions, more confusion, possibly anxiety than it answers, right? So we need to, whenever we're putting out communication, especially on a company-wide level or even a team-wide level, we want to be clear with ourselves. What are our goals for this communication? Why are we sending it? What are we trying to get across from people? what is the best way to do that? Should this be written communication or should this be delivered verbally? Right? You need to think through all of those things and be real strategic, with your communication plans. Training and coaching, super important, right? Especially for your managers. For a lot of people, especially if they move to remote or hybrid as a result of the pandemic or even after the pandemic, this is very new. It doesn't matter how experienced of a manager you are. I would actually argue that sometimes more experienced managers who did not previously have remote and hybrid experience, this can be the biggest adjustment for. The way we used to manage, right? When everybody was in office, I can argue that they weren't terribly effective even then, even in an office. However, they really are not effective when it comes to managing in a remote or hybrid. So make sure that your managers have some basic training over how to operate in a hybrid or remote environment, and then make sure they have support and coaching to help them continue to develop and learn and get stronger over time. If you're hybrid in particular, make sure that, recognition, rewards, praise, celebrations, those shouldn't just be if you can happen to make it into the office, right? You have to find a way to extend that out into your full environment, which includes your remote space. Now, I'm not going to lie, I'll be completely vulnerable here. This can be one of the hardest parts of a remote environment, particularly the celebration side of it. I think rewards and praise, you can develop some good practices, and there's a lot of technology and opportunities to make that a pretty seamless thing, depending on how you want to approach it. Celebrations can be really difficult. So again, when we talk about actively managing the culture, this is something that, for us, we've always tried to pay extra attention to. And get lots of feedback from people over what would be meaningful for them, what would they like in terms of celebrating big wins. And then you do want to make sure that you're investing in some team building tools. So what does that mean? Let's talk a little bit about that. Before you get into which tools you need, right? You want to think about your practices, your best practices, what you're going to adopt, and what your approach is going to be. When you have remote and hybrid teams, particularly if you're spread across a number of time zones, right? If you are a global organization, or even if you are US based, but you have folks in Alaska, Hawaii, things like that, asynchronous communication and collaboration is really key. So you have to make sure that you have some clear direction over what that should look like, and also that you provide the tools for people to be able to do that. I highly encourage you using video intentionally. I know a lot of organizations, they default to cameras always on. If they're talking, there's more than one person in the room, so to speak, cameras are on. I don't know that that's necessarily wrong or bad, right? What I will say is, if you're going to be intentional about your culture, when you're working remotely, video is a big piece of that, right? So I encourage you to be intentional about it. Does it serve a need in whatever particular meeting, conversation, training, webinar you may be doing? Is there any value added by being on video, right? We made the determination there's no value to y'all having to look at my face. It's really about the information in the slides. So I didn't turn my camera on. And I'm hopeful that the experience is no less as a result of that. When we talk about, helping managers be more effective, right? A lot of this comes here. Focus on results and purpose. What's the purpose? That's the why. What is the impact of the work that people are being asked to do? What is the impact of the outcomes that they create, right? And what are those results? That should be the focus, not which hours are people working, or where are they working from, or are they on camera or not on camera? Are they, Do they like music on or music? Like all of those things don't matter. What are they wearing? What does their hair look like? None of those things matter, right? Um, so really be focused on those results and what the impact of the work is. Think about the needs. So this is from an HR kind of policy perspective. Think about the needs of your hybrid employees, your remote employees, and think about what benefits you can offer that help support that, right? So it may be things around technology or internet access. It may be things around some sort of wellness stipend or wellness program from sort of that holistic viewpoint, right? Mentally, emotionally, physically. So think about what's going to be valuable because that may not be the same as when everybody was in office, right? It doesn't mean that the coffee bar has to go away from the office, but maybe we try and say we're saving a little money there because not as many people are in the office. So can we divert some of that budget over to some other kinds of benefits that will support that hybrid and remote environment for people? You want to be real intentional about getting feedback from people and then adjusting. I'm not talking about adjusting if you are comfortable with your culture, right? As an organization, you're comfortable with your culture. I'm not talking about making core adjustments. I'm talking about programs and initiatives, right? So I led people in culture for FlexJobs for 11 years. There are things that we did in year 1, 2, 3 that we didn't do in year 4, 5, 6. Maybe we picked it back up in year a little bit and then let it go again. So make sure you make those adjustments based on what's relevant and useful and meaningful to your people.
Carol, if I might
Yes.
ask a question here, I think any of us who have ever, used feedback surveys, we know sometimes you just don't get good feedback. So if, you're trying to implement culture initiatives to improve things, make it a healthier culture, and you're not getting much feedback, do you just kind of stay the course, or do you try to adjust and improve sans feedback? What would your approach there be?
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, it depends on what you're looking at, right? Like if everything feels healthy and sound in the organization and you're not getting a lot of feedback, right? Anybody who's worked in any frame where you need customer feedback, and that's essentially what we're talking about here. We know that people are sort of oriented towards giving negative feedback when they have it and saying nothing when it's good. Right? So you can take that approach, but I would look at bigger indicators, right? You should have some indicators that sort of touch the health of your culture beyond just specific feedback or what people are telling you, right? So whatever that looks like for some companies, it might be outside of the traditional engagement survey or even just culture survey, it might be that we do pulse checks on a regular cadence. How are those going? How is the productivity? What does your tenure look like? Are you losing talent? Right. So you may need to look at other things. You should be looking at other things to diagnose the health of your culture at any given moment beyond just somebody saying, well, I don't really like that Slack channel and I don't want to be in it anymore. Okay, cool. Right. Or not saying anything at all.
No, that's helpful. It's good to know that there are some warning signs that the health of your culture could be in danger. So that's helpful. Thank you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So what are some must-have virtual tools? Don't feel like you have to be locked onto any of these brands. We're really just, giving some suggestions and talking about like the intent of them. So certainly from an instant messaging Slack, anybody who has used Slack will tell you it is so much more than just messaging. The way you can create workflows and really use it as both a personal and a management tool is pretty powerful. So anybody who is working in virtual space, whether that's fully remote or hybrid, Slack, or if there's something comparable, please let us know. I'm not aware of anything that is quite as powerful as Slack, and it's an absolutely fabulous tool. Social networking. This could be possibly through an intranet. There are sites. This is probably a Microsoft product. So there's a platform called Yammer. And I'll be perfectly honest, now that I'm seeing this on here, and of course I looked at these slides 15 times last week, but they might actually be pulling back on Yammer with Teams now. But the point of it is you want to have a space, whether that's Slack or something else, where you can create some social interactions with people that are asynchronous, right? So one quick way to do that would be maybe to have a channel. If you don't have Yammer, you don't want to invest in yet another tool. Maybe you have a channel in Slack that is about pet coworkers. And from a social perspective, people can join that channel who have animals at home and they love their animals and it's a big part of their family and they are their colleagues and coworkers at home, and they can talk about that and share pictures and things like that, right? Have a space for that. Have a space for those kinds of connections between people. Video conferencing, something like Zoom, Microsoft Teams, not just for the video part of it. Again, use it when it makes sense is what I would encourage you. But also there's a power in being able to have a community in one space where you can do things like ask questions, give feedback, through emojis or things like that, share things on your screen. Those are really important for connecting people in a remote or hybrid environment. Collaboratively, you want to have something, whether that's a GitHub type thing, Zen Hub. I would even argue going into the file sharing, things like Google Docs certainly can be collaborative in nature, right? You can work on things together, have the comments. Getting into file sharing, again, things like Dropbox, where things can be moved back and forth with ease and with a sense of security, is really important. And then from an organizational level, from a project management, and you don't necessarily have to be a project manager to utilize these. There's a lot of different use cases for things like Trello or Asana, where you can have, you can just keep, those initiatives, those priorities, and those steps in the progress can be really transparent to everybody who is working on a particular team or project. Okay. So to wrap us up, I apologize. I feel like I'm going a little bit long here. But when we talk about how do you foster and sustain, so you've done the work, you've started building this culture, and you're feeling really good. You've got a good foundation going, and you're noticing a difference, right? So what do you do then? Keep in mind, culture changes, right? If you change out leadership, if you change out teams, if you change company priorities, if you change big workflows, anything like that, it can cause shifts in your culture and what the needs are. So make sure you're paying attention and managing actively. This is a really big one. Be sure your impact matches your intention. What does that mean? Lots of organizations, lots of people in general have really great intentions for what they're about to do or say. And then it's done or said, and the impact on the person that it was supposed to be positive for is not necessarily positive, right? So part of that comes with having that safe space, that ability to gather feedback that is true and proactive, and don't have too big of an ego with it. I would say impact is important or intention is important, because knowing that somebody is coming from a good place can really help. But if that impact is not doing what and it doesn't even have to be bad, maybe it's just not getting you where you thought it would, right? So really don't just know what your intention is, what your goal is, and throw it out there. Look at what the impact of that is. This, goes along with what we've already talked about in terms of being adaptable. So if something has been effective for a period of time and then you notice that it's less effective or there's less engagement with it, take a look at it, consider moving on to something different or pivoting the existing program or initiative. And that also brings us to our last point, being willing to move on when it's not working any longer. some key pieces to this, particularly from an employee perspective, right? What's that feedback loop look like? How can people give and receive both positive feedback and feedback for redirection? What does that look like? What is the process in the mechanism within your organization to have that happen in a healthy and 360 way? People should be able to opt in and out of team building events. Now, that's, again, a little bit of a provocative statement. If you're a team of 5 and you are doing some sort of team building exercise for a specific purpose, then yeah, that's probably not an opt out, right? If you are an HR professional or you are an engagement professional and you are hosting a trivia night, let people opt in and out of those things, and don't take it personally. Don't take it as a lack of interest. Just let people do what they need to do at any given moment in time. Think about your definition of flexibility and expand what that means. Flexibility, don't rest on, well, you can work from home somewhere all of the time. Go further with it. What else does that mean? Can I work my own schedule that suits me? Can I start early, maybe take a break in the middle of the day and then work later at night? And it doesn't have to necessarily be for a business case. Sometimes it's around time zones and people you're collaborating with that drive that need. Sometimes it's around, hey, the way my life is structured and the other things that I am responsible for, this is what works best for me. If the person can be present in the time that you want them and need them to be present, and they are consistently meeting expectations or exceeding with the outcomes that you would expect from their work, let them have the flexibility to really create the full experience that they need to be their best selves, right? And then make sure you're collaborating with people. We talked about, starting with the values, is it top down, bottom up? Culture overall cannot just be top down. It has to be supported, definitely, in very real and intentional ways from leadership. But it also has to be a living, breathing, collaborative thing that employees feel like they have a voice with.
Carol, thank you very much for sharing that information with us and allowing me to interject with some questions along the way. We are a couple minutes over our time here, but if I could maybe ask one more question from the Q&A. Someone has asked if FlexJobs has established, or if there is a way to establish sort of a quantifiable correlation between a healthy culture and business performance. Are there actual tangible measurements there that you can highlight?
Sure. We definitely have some at FlexJobs, and that could be a good starting point. But really, you have to look within your own organization and what are the business expectations, right? So, what may be an expectation or important to us may not be the same for everybody. Now, there are some basic things that we can talk about that honestly should be pretty universal, right? So, things like retention rates, things around onboarding surveys. So when you have a new hire come in the door, you could create an onboarding survey or feedback loop that lets you know, like, what was this experience like? What's working? What's not? So that's smart, not only from an employee experience point of view, right? It allows you to catch things that may be going a little bit off course or be a little bit confusing early, but it also allows you to quantify those onboarding efforts. So it could be something around that. We look at tenure and how does that compare within our space. We look at, when we do look at attrition, we also look at like regrettable turnover, right? So we pay attention to those numbers. We use a platform called 15Five for engagement and communication and feedback. And so we do pulse check-ins. We do check-ins either on a weekly or bi-weekly basis, depending on your role within the company. And a piece of that is a quick pulse score, 1 through 5, right? So we're able to watch that, know what our norms are, both from an organization, from a team, from an individual basis, and we're able to see if something appears to be going wrong. Now, that may not be a reflection of the culture, but it'll tell you that something's wrong, right? So those are just some real quick. I know we're over time, so I don't want to go too deep into this, but those are just some quick things that you can be thinking about. But really, you want to look at the business goals of your own organization and how do you tie these efforts back to reflect the impact.
Wonderful. Yeah, I appreciate you taking the time to answer that question here. Big thank you to Carol for joining us today and providing so many great insights. Thank you to everyone who took the time to attend today. We really hope this was helpful for you. Just as a quick reminder, later this week, you will receive an email with a copy of the recording. So on behalf of FlexJobs and our career experts team, just want to say thank you again to everyone who attended, and I hope everyone has a wonderful day. Thank you.